Welcome to Secrets of History, a series of lectures exploring the conspiratorial view of history. It is the contention of historian Ralph Epperson that wars, revolutions, and depressions are planned years in advance, and that those who have been involved in the planning of these events have been ensuring that their involvement has been removed from recorded history. It will be Ralph Epperson's purpose to discuss the major events of the past and to remove the veil that has been utilized to cover up the secrets of history.
Welcome to Secrets of History. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I'm the host for this series. Secrets of History is a 24-week lecture series exploring the conspiratorial view of history. I have been studying the view of history that holds that the major events of the past have been planned years in advance. And I've been studying that for 24 years of my life. About 2 years ago, I published my book entitled The Unseen Hand. I've subtitled it An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History. That book came out in 1985. Tonight we're going to continue our study of the early years of the banking system in America's history around the time of the 1880s to about 1920 or so. And last week we were discussing how the graduate income tax and the central bank were both being offered to the American people at the same time. I'm going to show you why that was and why the two of them are important, that they both seem to go together. I want you to remember that the central bank and the graduate income tax, as I said, do go together. I want you to remember that Karl Marx, the so-called father of communism, wrote about the need to create a central bank and to impose a graduated income tax on the people as two methods to communize what he called an advanced nation. Another who spoke out about the income tax in 1894 was Congressman Robert Adams. He said this in the Congress on January the 26th, 1894. Number 2, the imposition of the income tax will corrupt the people. It will bring the spy and the informer. It will necessitate a swarm of officials with inquisitorial powers. It will be a step towards centralization. Where are you today, Congressman Adams, when we're fighting the income tax even today? Boy, that's a rather prophetic statement, wasn't it? In 1895, the first income tax was declared unconstitutional because Congress simply had no authority to pass an income tax. The next individual we must discuss is Colonel Edward Mandell House. We talked briefly about him in our study of the Civil War last week. One cannot understand the early years of the 20th century without knowing about this gentleman. Colonel House wrote a book in 1912 called Philip Drew Administrator. And there's his name, Colonel Edward Mandell House on the bottom. Philip Drew Administrator, and that's the subject of this book, the White House. The book starts, I'll briefly give you a review of the book because I would encourage you to read it because this book is extremely important to our understanding of what's going to happen in the next few minutes of this lecture and also about the time of our history, early history in the 1900s. This book detailed a meeting in 1925 between a man by the name of John Thor. By the way, this is a fictional work, but he did have some interesting characters and they represented some interesting things. John Thor was called in the book the High Priest of Finance, and I believe his purpose in the book is to represent the world of the banking establishment. And this John Thor met with a senator by the name of Selwyn. That's the only name, as I remember, he tells us about this man. I don't think it has his first name in there. But anyway, these two gentlemen, John Thor and Senator Selwyn, were meeting. And they were talking in that meeting about the election of the president. Colonel House says this about his character, Senator Selwyn, number 3. Senator Selwyn, to whom it was a fascinating game to govern the nation with an absolute hand and yet not be known as the directing power. Let's continue, number 4. The senator wanted to get within the little group that controlled the party and the nation. He also wanted to bring under his control both the Senate and the Supreme Court. So here we see the idea. Understand, we're talking here about running the government from behind the scenes and also controlling not only the government but the Supreme Court and the Senate. The Senate and the Supreme Court. These two gentlemen, Thor and Selwyn, meet in secret, and they conspire to elect James C. Rockland a governor of a state in the Midwest to the presidency of the United States. The meeting is accidentally taped, and the next morning when the secretary goes to record what is taped on the dictaphone, or the equivalent of a dictaphone, he hears about the secret meeting where the banker and the senator meet and conspire to elect a man not of the choosing of the American people. The secretary gives the tapes to the newspapers, and they publish the story about high finance and how senators conspire to elect people the American people don't want. So the people revolt in the story, and they're led by Philip Drew, the hero of the book. Philip Drew leads an army of 500,000 men on to Washington, D.C. And I want you to remember the number 500,000. We're going to see it again at least twice more in the next few weeks, where an army of 500,000, the exact number, was intended to march on Washington, D.C. Please remember that number, 500,000. Drew, the leader of the 500,000-man army, takes over the government of the United States, but does not remove the presidency. He just gives him non-strategic, non-important functions. And then Drew gives the American government the power. He becomes the secret behind the power. And when he takes over, according to the book, he gives America number 5. Drew gives America socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. Let me repeat that. Drew is a Marxist, a communist, and gives America, quote, socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, unquote. Drew calls the Constitution obsolete. And we're going to see that again as well, because there are citizens in America today who believe America's Constitution is obsolete. Drew gives America several programs right out of Marx's Communist Manifesto. Now, we've covered these in the past. When we studied Karl Marx and communism, maybe 3, 4, 5 weeks ago, we identified these. We're going to show them to you again tonight in the next few minutes. Drew gives America, number 6, a graduated income tax. This is Marx's second plank in the Communist Manifesto, and that second plank called for a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. So we got that in this book written by Colonel Edward Manville House. Drew also gave America an inheritance tax right out of Marx's manifesto. Drew banned the selling of property for profit. You might remember that Marx said that the communists were going to abolish the right to private property, and Drew took a giant step towards the Marxist goal by making it illegal to sell private property for a profit in his book. In that book, Drew wonders when Russia's deliverance would come. There was, number 7, he knew, great work for someone to do in that despotic land. So here we see Colonel House hoping that something would happen, that someone would come to deliver Russia, because he said it was a despotic land. I want you to remember, this book was written in 1912. The first revolution in Russia was 7 years prior to the writing of this book, but this book was written 5 years prior to the Russian Revolution. How did Colonel House know what was going to happen 5 years later in Russia? I believe he knew very well, because House was, I believe, a key to that revolution in Russia, led by the American capitalists. We'll cover that further in this series, probably in about 4 or 5 more weeks. Colonel House was instrumental in making Woodrow Wilson the President of the United States in 1912. Colonel House later went on to become Wilson's key advisor. Now, this is a picture of Colonel House and President Wilson. That's Colonel House on the left of that picture. According to the writer G.S. Viereck, Colonel House, quote, admits that his book formulates, number 8, his ethical and political faith. Colonel House sees himself in his hero. Philip Drew is what he himself, Philip Drew is what House would like to have been. Every act in House's career as the advisor to President Wilson, every word of advice that passed from House to Woodrow Wilson was consistent with the ideas enunciated by Philip Drew. If Mr. Viereck is right, President Woodrow Wilson's chief advisor, a Marxist, consistently gave Wilson Marxist advice. Remember, I didn't say that. Colonel House said it himself. Colonel House also said this about Woodrow Wilson, number 9. I never met a man whose thoughts ran so identically with mine. House admitted that Wilson shared his Marxist ideas. Here's what Wilson said about Colonel House. Quote, House is my second personality. He is my second self. His thoughts and mine are one, unquote. Wilson admitted that he thought the Marxist ideas of his chief advisor, Colonel Edward Mandell House. Once again, here's another quote about what Colonel House said about President Wilson, number 9. I never met a man whose thoughts ran so identically to mine. We've already read this. I'm sorry, this is a duplicate. You might recall our series a few weeks ago that showed America got 3 major planks of Marx's 10-plank program to communize America during the first 4 years of Wilson's 8-year administration. We received Marx's second plank, the graduated income tax, in 1913. We received Marx's 5th plank, the central bank, our privately owned Federal Reserve, in 1913. And we received Marx's inheritance tax, his 3rd plank, in 1916, all because Wilson's thoughts and the thoughts of House were the same, identical thoughts. And House's thoughts were those of Karl Marx. Now, President Wilson is a real paradox. He was a part of this conspiracy, yet he openly advocated that, or acknowledged that it existed. Listen to this rather strange quote, one that I believe is very accurate. Woodrow Wilson wrote this, number 10. There is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. What power was he talking about? I believe it's the power of this conspiracy that we're exploring in this series. One of the readers of Philip Drew Administrator was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who personally received his copy of the book from Colonel House. It's interesting to note that Wilson appointed Roosevelt as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during Wilson's 2 terms as President of the United States. Now, this is a picture of Colonel House and Roosevelt together, and that's Colonel House to Roosevelt's right. So here we see House and Roosevelt together. In 1938, House said, quote, during the last 15 years, I have been close to the center of things, although few people suspect it. No important foreigner has come to America without talking to me. I was close to the movement that nominated Franklin Roosevelt. He has given me free hand in advising Secretary of State Cordell Hull. All the ambassadors have reported to me frequently. Now, wait a minute. Who elected Colonel Edward Mandell House? Nobody, except Woodrow Wilson selected him to be his advisor. Yet here he says, no important foreigner came to America without seeing me. No ambassador came to America without seeing me. And I was there, and I helped nominate Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So House was like Senator Selwyn in his book, Philip Drew Administrator. He governed the nation, but wasn't known as the directing power, just like Philip Drew Administrator. The next event in America's history I'd like to discuss was the artificial panic of 1907. J.P. Morgan, America's best-known banker, visited Europe in March of 1907. He visited both Paris and London, by coincidence the homes of 2 of the branches of the Rothschild Bank. He has been described as, quote, the top American agent of the English Rothschilds, unquote. I believe Morgan was in the employ of the Rothschilds. When Morgan returned to America, he started a rumor that the Knickerbocker Bank of New York was insolvent. People believed him. They went to their banks, went to that bank to find out if their money was there, and sure enough, as we talked about last week, the money was not there. Mr. Morgan was right. Others said, wait a minute, if Morgan was right about that bank in New York, maybe he's right about my bank in Iowa. And they went to their bank in Iowa, and all at the same time, and sure enough, their money was not there either, for the reasons we covered last week. This run started in New York, it went nationwide, and it caused a nationwide panic. Then J.P. Morgan offered the solution to the panic of 1907. What America needed was guess what? A central bank. The bankers caused the problem, and then they offered their solution, a central bank, owned by the bankers who had conned the public. The next individual I'd like to introduce you to is Nelson Aldrich, the maternal grandfather of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller and his brother David Rockefeller. Mr. Aldrich was Senator Aldrich, elected to the Senate in 1880. According to this book, called The Rockefellers, an American Dynasty, written by Peter Collier and David Horowitz, when Nelson Aldrich was elected to the Senate, he was worth an estimated $50,000. When he left the Senate, 30 years later, he was worth $30 million. That's what I like, a real public servant. He made a few dollars when he was a senator, didn't he? By the way, Senator Nelson Aldrich was also a member of the Masonic Order. Now it is time for the press to jump into the fray. The press started blaming Wall Street, this unknown banking center, and they were blamed for causing the panic. And then they said, what we need is J.P. Morgan's solution, a central bank, to take the control of the money supply out of this thing called Wall Street. So the American people started to listen. The next step occurred in 1909 when Congress created the National Monetary Commission. They were charged with making, quote, a thorough study of financial practices before formulating banking and currency reform legislation, unquote. Guess who they appointed to this commission? Senator Nelson Aldrich was appointed as head of the National Monetary Commission. Senator Aldrich toured Europe, and when he returned, he stated that what America needed was, quote, guess what? A central bank, unquote. On November the 22nd, 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich, international banker Paul Warburg, and a small group of American bankers, mostly connected to J.P. Morgan's banks, boarded Aldrich's private railroad car and journeyed to Jekyll Island, Georgia. And there they stayed at the Jekyll Island Hunt Club, guess what, owned by J.P. Morgan. It was a private club. They were told to keep their names to the first name only. They were not to discuss the purpose of their visit. They were to remain relatively obscure, not to meet frequently on the railroad car or anywhere else. And when they got there, they had a purpose. They were to write the Federal Reserve Bill to give America the central bank. Paul Warburg is an interesting individual. His brother Max Warburg ran the family bank called M.N. Warburg in Frankfurt, Germany. Paul came to the United States in 1902, and he will later become the first chairman of the Federal Reserve. He helped write the bill. He gets rewarded with the first chairmanship of the Federal Reserve. For whatever it's worth, and this isn't very important, it's just kind of an interesting little sidelight, Paul Warburg is said to have inspired Daddy Warbucks in Little Orphan Annie. I believe you can see the amazing similarities between Paul Warburg and Daddy Warbucks. I believe that cartoon's still being drawn. I think I see every once in a while. Daddy Warbucks perhaps is Paul Warburg. The people at the Jekyll Island retreat had a problem. The American people didn't want a central bank. Number 12. The main problem was to avoid the name central bank. because the American people had fought the war, the American Revolution of 1776, the War of 1812, and the Civil War over this issue. And for that reason, they had to come up upon the designation of Federal Reserve System. It would be owned by private individuals who would draw profit from ownership of shares and who would control the nation's issue of money. If you control the nation's issue of money, you can increase the money supply, called inflation, and then decrease the money supply, called deflation. When you do that, you can make profits on upturns and downturns of the business cycle. The next problem was getting the president to sign the Federal Reserve legislation. The president in 1912 was William Howard Taft. President Taft was on record as being opposed to the creation of the Federal Reserve. He was going to veto the bill. William Howard Taft was a Republican elected in 1908 and was obviously seeking re-election in 1912, and he had to be defeated because he was opposed to the plans of this conspiracy, this banking conspiracy. Now notice what happened. Here we have a man seeking re-election and was opposed to the bill, and they had fought wars and revolutions over that creation of that bill, and one man now stood in their way, President William Howard Taft. He was going to veto the bill if it got past Congress and into the White House. So their first priority became the defeat of William Howard Taft in the primaries. And they asked Teddy Roosevelt, a fellow Republican who was president in 1904, to defeat Taft in the primaries. Roosevelt could not defeat Taft in the primaries, and Taft won the nomination. The next step was to defeat Taft in the general election. Colonel House, as we've already read, assisted Woodrow Wilson, Democrat, to seek the presidency, and he assisted him in running. Woodrow Wilson was obviously in favor of the Federal Reserve Bill. The people who were behind Woodrow Wilson ran a survey and discovered that Taft was going to be re-elected with about 60% of the vote to Wilson's 40%. One man stood in their way. They had to defeat Taft by running someone against him with a three-party ticket: Wilson, Taft, and guess who? Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was urged to create a thing called the Bull Moose Party. The major contributors to Roosevelt and the Bull Moose Party were J.P. Morgan and his partners and agents. Dividing the vote to get an unpopular candidate elected is not something that's new. It was tried back in, I believe it was the 70s, in Chile, when the conspirators wanted Salvador Allende, a Marxist, elected. A man by the name of Frey, F-R-E-I, was going to be elected, I believe, and they decided to run a third candidate against him to defeat Frey and elect Salvador Allende. Allende was a Marxist, and he had to be elected, and he was by running a third candidate. And they divided Frey's vote, and Allende was elected. In 1972, the same strategy occurred when they ran when they wanted to elect George McGovern, or at least nominate George McGovern. You might recall that it was estimated that Hubert Humphrey was going to seek the renomination. He had won once again in '68, and he was going to win by about 70 to 30. And the only way that McGovern could win in the Democratic primaries was to divide the vote of Hubert Humphrey. And they did that, and the Democrats offered about 30 candidates. That's probably not correct, but there was a multiplicity of candidates being offered. For what reason? To divide the vote of Hubert Humphrey. The McGovern supporters were very loyal, and they stayed with him, and McGovern won the nomination probably with only about 30% of the vote. It's a very common strategy. You offer many candidates, and the one man that you want wins with a minority of the vote. So now we've got the election of 1912. Taft, Wilson, and Roosevelt. Wilson was given about 45% of the vote. Roosevelt got about 30%, and Taft got about 25%. If you add the vote together of Roosevelt and Taft, and there's no guarantee that those who voted for Roosevelt would have voted for Taft, but if you do add those two together, you get 55% of the vote against Wilson's 45%. Roosevelt and Taft were both Republicans. It would seem to fit that those who supported Roosevelt would probably have supported Taft in a two-man race. Wilson won with only 45% of the vote. Wilson was in favor of signing the Federal Reserve Bill. Wilson was inaugurated in January of 1913, and the Federal Reserve Bill was signed in December of 1913. What these people had planned the American Revolution for, what they had planned the War of 1812 for, what they had planned the Civil War for, what they had planned the crashes, the panics of 1873, 1893, and 1907 was finally realized with the passage of the Federal Reserve Bill in 1913. It had taken them over nearly 140 years to get the central bank that they'd wanted. An incredible piece of legislation. What did America get with the passage of the Federal Reserve Bill? Now, this is the cover of a book entitled The Federal Reserve System, and it's published by the Federal Reserve Board. Now, I got this copy of this book in college, and I got it when I took a class in money and banking. It's put out by the Federal Reserve. Please remember that. And inside this book, they tell us what the purpose of the Federal Reserve is. Number 13, an efficient monetary mechanism is indispensable to the nation. I want you to remember this is being written by those inside the Federal Reserve. The function of the Federal Reserve is to foster a flow of money and credit that will facilitate 1. Orderly economic growth, 2. A stable dollar, and 3. Long-run balance in our international payments. Now, I ask you, since the passage of the Federal Reserve Bill in 1913, has America had orderly economic growth, a stable dollar, and long-run balance in our international payments? I think you would have to agree with me that it has not had those objects. If you agree with me that they've not had their success as they were intended to be, then that means that the board of directors of the Federal Reserve are either dumb or smart. Either they're doing what they're supposed to do or they're dumb. If they're dumb and they're not doing what they're supposed to do by giving us stable dollar and long-run balances, then you fire the Federal Reserve. But nobody has ever been fired from the chairmanship of the Federal Reserve. If that's true, and secondly, by the way, not ever has there been one Federal Reserve chairman ever rejected by the Senate. If that's true, then that must mean that they're doing the job they're supposed to be doing. They're smart. They're giving us these business cycles because that's their purpose, is to give us these business cycles. Let me just use my hand here to illustrate that. We get these upswings and downswings of the economy like this since 1913. If they've continued to give us that, and they're not supposed to give us that, then we fire them, but they've never been fired. That means we're supposed to get those business cycles. They're doing what they were created for. They're not dumb, they're smart. Now, this article shows what I'm talking about. These two articles were attached to each other. You might see that I've got it cut at an angle. And I've cut them and to put them onto one sheet of a paper. So we'll read the top article, and it says, quote, Reserve Board raises lending rate for banks. It talked about how the Federal Reserve had increased the interest it charged its member banks. The bottom article attached to the top article says, quote, Wall Street values plunge, unquote. In other words, the action of the Federal Reserve caused the stock market to go down. If you had known that the Federal Reserve was going to take that action before they took it, you could have made a profit selling your stock and then reinvesting it at the lower price. Now, this is another article that supports my contention. Its headline reads, Rumored Fed action spurs loss. Here, just the thought that the Fed might take an action causes the stock market to go down. If you had known that they were going to rumor they were going to do this, you would have sold your stock. That's the danger of having a Federal Reserve. Now, this whole point was humorously illustrated in a cartoon I want to show you. It shows here a doctor talking to the chairman of the Federal Reserve. This was drawn while Paul Volcker was the chairman, on the couch in the psychologist's office. He says, Volcker says, "You know, Doc, it's not easy being Paul Volcker. Sometimes I go into a deep depression." And the doctor, as you'll notice, is on the phone saying to a stockbroker, "Sell." In other words, they know when Volcker goes into depression, the whole nation goes into a depression. When Volcker gets up, if he increases the money supply, whatever he does, the whole nation goes up. Someone tried to warn us about the Federal Reserve. Once again, Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr. wrote this, number 14. "This act, the Federal Reserve Act, establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the President signs this act, the invisible government, notice, the invisible government, by the money power, the same words that Lincoln called it, the same phrase, the money power, will be legalized. The new law will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created." Charles Lindbergh, where are you today? How federal is the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve, number 15, is a private organization, since the member banks own all the stock on which they, the member banks, receive, guess what, tax-free dividends. The Federal Reserve must pay postage like any other private corporation. Its employees are not on civil service. It may spend whatever it wishes, and its physical property held under private deeds is not subject to local taxation. In other words, it is not federal, it is private. In speeches, President Richard Nixon has called it the independent Federal Reserve. President Gerald Ford called it the independent Federal Reserve. President Jimmy Carter called it the independent Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve Chairman, about 20 years ago or so, Dr. Arthur Burns spoke about the Fed's autonomy. The Associated Press called it the nation's independent central bank. The House of Representatives, in a primer on money, called it independent. Vice President George Bush said it was independent. They know, don't they? This article states that the Ninth Circuit Court in 1983, this is a federal court of our land, said that the Federal Reserve was privately owned. It says that the court found that, quote, "the reserve banks are independent, privately owned, and locally controlled corporations," unquote. The Federal Reserve knows it is not federal. Now, this is an advertisement for programmers placed in a computer magazine by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. The ad reads in part, quote, "The Federal Reserve Bank, some people still think we're a branch of the government. We're not. We're the bank's bank." Ralph Epperson calls it what it is. It is the private reserve. It is not federal. I'm on a one-man crusade to start changing the name of this private corporation to what it is, the private reserve. Please join me. Let's all call it what it is, the private reserve. How profitable has the private reserve been to its owners? Someone once figured out in 1939, this is 26 years after it was created, and put the figures into the congressional record. Now, I want to go to the blackboard and show you just how much profit the private reserve has made, according to one individual, in 26 years of its business. In 1914, the private reserve was bought by the private bankers for a capital stock of $134 million. Okay? $134 million. Now, I'm going to try to keep my zeros lined up here. Let's do this. Now, in 1937, the capital stock has made a profit of $23 billion $141 million. In 26 years, on an original investment of $134 million, the private reserve has made $23 billion worth of profit. That's not too shabby, is it? That's what you call your exorbitant profit. I'd like to make that once in a while myself. Not too shabby. By the way, when you compute the actual percentage of that profit, it's 1,727% profit. Not too shabby, is it? Who pays for that profit? We, the taxpayers. We're being conned. What has the private reserve done with the money supply? Don't forget, they admitted in their own book, we're going to have control of the money and credit of the nation. Number 16. In 1913, the money supply per capita was $148. And using that as our base, we'll say our dollar's value was then $1. In 1978, 65 years later, the money supply per capita was $3,691, and its value was 12 cents. That's called inflation. Now notice, I gave you per capita figures. You can't say, well, Ralph, they've been increasing the money supply to accommodate the increase in the population, can you? That is a per capita figure. Each of us is supposed to have, what did have in 1913, $148. Now each of us has $3,691. Has there been an inflation of the money supply? Yes. Has there been a decrease in the value of the dollar? Yes. In 65 years, the money supply has gone up 25 times, and the value of a dollar was only 1/8 of its pre-private reserve value. The quantity of money in January 1968 was $351 billion. The quantity of money in February 1980 was $976 billion, a 278% increase. The money supply doubles almost every 10 years. Has there been a resulting decrease in our value? Yes. Has there been an increase in the money supply? Yes. Has there been inflation? Yes. Now, you can verify those figures anytime you want to by going to your local library and getting a copy of this bulletin. Now, they've mislabeled it. They call it the Federal Reserve Bulletin. That's a misnomer because it's not federal, it's private. So it's really the Private Reserve Bulletin. It comes out, this particular one goes way back to 1974. But you can get a copy and read it for yourself. It tells you what the money supply is each month. Check it out. You can find out yourself what they're doing to the money supply. Some of America's bankers were figuring it out and were actually withdrawing from the control of the private reserve. In 1978, 25% of all bank deposits and 60% of all banks were outside of the system. The then chairman of the private reserve was William Miller. William Miller told the Senate Banking Committee, quote, this is the chairman of the private reserve speaking, quote, the ability of the system to influence the nation's money supply becomes weaker, unquote. In other words, there's too many bankers that we can't control. And when we can't control them, we can't control the inflation and the deflation. So Congress moved to solve the problem. They passed the Monetary Control Act of 1980, which gave the private reserve system control of all depository institutions, including those that had freely chosen to withdraw. Don't forget, America is the land of the free unless you're a banker. With the private reserve in place, it was possible to properly finance a war. And by coincidence, World War I started in 1916. Now this is how the private reserve financed World War I. So we're now going to finance the private reserve, number 17. The private reserve is going to finance World War I, number 17. Now we notice here, I've got here the columns, the year we're going to talk about. Then the receipts of government, how much money did they take in, how much did they spend out, and then we're going to show on the right-hand side either the deficit or the surplus. In 1916, we show that the government took in $761 million and spent $713 million for a deficit, actually in this case, a surplus of $48 million. In 1917, as the war got rolling, we start noticing a rapid increase in the deficit. In 1917, the deficit was $853 million. In 1918, the deficit was $9 billion. In 1919, the deficit was $13 billion. And then after the war was over, in 1920, we returned back to a normal surplus, in that case of $291 billion. I want you to notice the increase in the government between 1916 and 1920. In 1916, the government spent only $713 million. In 1920, it spent over $6 billion, about 9 times as much spending. You get control of the banks, you increase spending. Soon after the private reserve was created, they started exercising their new powers. The first depression the private reserve caused was the crash of 1920. Some discovered their plans. Now this is Congressman Charles Lindbergh once again, and he wrote a book, I've got a rubber band around it, called Economic Pinch by C.A. Lindbergh. In this book, Congressman Lindbergh discovered what caused the crash of 1920. And once again, I want to apologize for the condition of these books. This one's falling apart, but I want you to notice I've read it, and you can get a copy and read it yourself. Let's now see what Congressman Lindbergh said about the crash of 1920. Number 18. Under the Federal Reserve Act, panics are scientifically created. Panics are scientifically created. The present panic of 1920 is the first scientifically created one, unquote. In other words, you sit down and you write a panic. You cause it and then you make money on it. Isn't that fun? Now here's how you scientifically create a panic. Between 1914 and 1919, the reserve system doubled the money supply. Credit was inexpensive. In other words, there's a lot of money. You can borrow it very inexpensively. The Private Reserve Board met on May the 18th, 1920, and decided to contract the money supply by calling in the loans. The result was that the national income dropped by $15 billion, causing unemployment all over America. In other words, the panic of 1920 did what it was supposed to do. It caused a panic and people went unemployed. The money supply was withdrawn. The panic of 1920 bankrupted 5,400 banks. But probably a high percentage of those banks were bought at a reduced price. And we're going to see how they did that in a few minutes. The next scientifically created crash was the stock market crash of 1929. Those who write the Accidental School of History blame President Herbert Hoover, the president at the time. President Hoover caused the crash of 1929. That's what we're told. Now here's how the private reserve caused the crash of 1929. I want to go back to the blackboard and show you how this process worked. And we're going to show you how the American people were literally destroyed by the private reserve. This is the way they did it. First of all, let's discuss the secret of how to make a profit in the stock market. I'd like to write a book. We just simply say, you open the book up and it says, the cover of the book says, how to make a killing in the stock market, and you open it up and it says, buy low and sell high. So you buy down here when the price is low, and you sell up here while the price is high. In other words, when the price goes up, you hold your stock, and then up here you start selling. And then you wait, and then you buy it down here, and you sell up here. The way you can do this and make a profit is if you know when they're going to increase the money supply and then decrease the money supply before it happens, then you can make a killing in the stock market, can't you? That's what it's only about. All you've got to do is know how or when these events are going to happen. If you know when the reserve is going to first increase the money supply and then decrease it, you can make exorbitant profits, can't you? Here's the way that the money supply was first increased and then decreased. Number 19. In 1920, in June, the quantity of money stood at $34.2 billion. This is how much money there was actually in circulation. In June of 1921, it reached its low point as they were calling the money in. They went down about 10% to $31.7 billion. That was a low. In June of 1929, the high quantity of money was reached. It was $45.7 billion. They had increased the money supply by about 50%, from a low of 31.7 to 45.7. And then after 29, they started decreasing the money supply. They went from a high of 45.7 to a low of $30.0 billion. And then in December, they started increasing, December 38, they started increasing the money supply again back to where it was, to about $46.5 billion. If you know when they're going to do that, you can make a fortune in the stock market, can't you? Now, if you're going to increase the money supply, how do you get it out in circulation? Here's one of the ways they did it during the crash of 1929. I'm going to go back to the blackboard and show you what they did with this increase of the money supply between 1920 and 1929. Let's just say that you decide in 1920 to start buying stock. And you say, wait a minute, I've heard this thing called Epperson Unlimited. Notice I don't limit Epperson. Epperson Unlimited is a great stock to buy, got great potential. So you buy a share of stock for $100. Now we're going to keep this without commission. You just buy the stock, you walk in with cash, and you pay them $100, and you buy one share of Epperson Unlimited. Now let's just presume that the stock market goes up. By the way, you don't borrow any money. Let's put that here next. So it's strictly $100. You walk in, you buy one share, and you get one share of stock. Now let's just say the stock market increases 10% to $110. So your stock goes from $100 to $110. That's this, because the rapid increase in money supply causes prices to go up. So let's say that you sell your stock when it gets to 110, and you take your profit of $10 or 10% on your money. You say, that's not too bad. That's a good short-term investment. I just made a 10% investment on my share of one share of stock for $100. I invested $100, made $10 for $110. The private reserve said, wait a minute, with all of this extra money in circulation, here's the way you can really make a killing in the stock market. We will loan you money by saying you can borrow money on margin to buy the stock. So let's just say you go into your stockbroker and say, I want to buy a share of Epperson Unlimited. He says, wait a minute, with $100, you can buy 10 shares because the margin is 10%. So you pay $100 cash, and you borrow $900 of money. This is the increase in the money supply. So for a $100 investment, you now own $1,000 worth of stock. You've borrowed $900. This is the increase in the money supply. They got the money out, called the stockbroker and says, get this money, loan it to people who want to buy stock. Then they said, now you own the stock. Now, if your shares go up, you now own 10 shares. If they go up 10%, your shares are now worth $1,100. So you sell your stock for $1,100. You pay back the bank $900. You now have $200 left over. So you make 100%. You've doubled your money, haven't you? On a $100 investment, you've made $100. In the same amount of time, you made $10 over here. This was the way they conned the American people into buying on margin. They increased the money supply, borrow the money to buy the stock. You can make 10 times as much money buying on margin. Now, the one detail I haven't given you yet is that this $900 was loaned out on what they called a 24-hour broker call loan basis. Now, what does that mean? That means that whenever they called to have their money back, you had 24 hours to pay back the $900. That doesn't sound so bad. So the stock gets up to $1,100. They want their money. You go to the stock market. You sell it for $1,100. You pay back the $900. You take your original investment, and you take your $100 profit. Everything's fine. Except when they call all the loans at the same time, everybody goes to the stock market to pay back the stockbroker who pays back the bank. When everybody goes to the stock market at the same time, what does that do to the price of stock? It goes down. Let's just presume that the stock market, when you get there to sell your stock, your 10 shares of Epperson Unlimited sell for $500. So you go to your banker and say, gee, I'm sorry, we had a little loss here, a little unexpected contingency. Here's all the money I've got. You can have it all. Here's $500. He said, no, wait a minute. You owe us $900. But you see, the stock market went down. I'm sorry it went down. You signed a contract. You owe us $900. But I've only got $500. We want $400 more. This is the way the private reserve crashed the market in 1929. The American people fell for it. The press kept saying, you can all be J.P. Morgans. Go to your stock market. Borrow money. Buy stock. And when they did, on October the 29th, 1929, they called the 24-hour broker call loans. And down went the market. Everybody was selling. At the same time, the market went down. And everybody lost. You now owed the bankers what you got back when you sold the stock, $500 plus $400 more. Tragic situation. But they had us. All this money and available credit caused the stock market to do these things. This is the stock market, in essence, the Dow Jones of the day, number 20. In 1919, the stock market was at $138.12. This is, in essence, the Dow Jones Industrial, just to show you these figures. In 1920, after the panic of 1921, after the panic of 1920, the stock market was down to $66.24. In 1929, because of the increase in money supply, the stock market was up to $469.49. In 1932, it was down to $57.62. Can you see the way they conned and then destroyed the American people? On October the 24th, 1929, the day they contracted the money supply, Winston Churchill visited the Visitors Gallery at New York in the Stock Exchange with Bernard Brooke, one of America's wealthiest men, and an advisor to President Roosevelt. I don't know why Winston Churchill came from England to come to the United States. I believe he was brought over here to show him the power of this money power that Lincoln talked about. This is the kind of power we have to cause a panic nationwide that's going to ripple all through the world in one day by contracting the money supply. You will pay back that which you borrowed. John Kenneth Galbraith, one of the world's leading economists, agreed with this assessment, number 21. John Kenneth Galbraith said, the man with the smart money who was safely out of the market when the first crash came naturally went back in to pick up bargains. Of course he did. Naturally, he said. Some people got out early. They got out in 1928 and went back to buy the stocks when they were low. They knew in advance what the private reserve was going to do. Someone else figured it out. This is and I like to say the Honorable Congressman Lewis McFadden. I believe one of America's truly great heroes. And Congressman McFadden was chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, and he said this, number 22. When the Federal Reserve Act was passed, the people of these United States did not perceive that a world system was being set up here. A superstate controlled by international bankers and international industrials acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure. The Depression, number 23, was not accidental. The Depression was not accidental. It was a carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here so that they might emerge as the rulers of us all. The money and credit resources of the United States were now in the complete control of J.P. Morgan and Paul Warburg. I charge them with the having taken over $80 billion from the United States government. Congressman McFadden actually went so far as to bring impeachment proceedings against the board of the Private Reserve. What happened? Was he hailed as a hero? Number 25. On 2 occasions, assassins attempted to kill McFadden with gunfire. Later, he died a few hours after attending a banquet, and there is little doubt that he was poisoned. You don't tamper with the money power. Some others don't agree. Well, we've quoted John Kenneth Galbraith in the past, but he's written this book entitled The Great Crash of 1929. I'll move my finger, and there at the bottom in blue you can see John Kenneth Galbraith, the author of this book, The Great Crash of 1929. In that book he says this about what caused the Great Depression. Number 26. The causes of the Great Depression are still far from certain. Now, I don't know, but if I could talk to John Kenneth Galbraith, I'd say, Mr. Galbraith, do you know what happened to Congressman McFadden? Maybe that's why you said what you said. I believe I know what caused it, the private reserve. 52% of all the banks went bankrupt during the crash of 1929. Today, number 27, 100 out of 14,100 banks, less than 1%, control 50% of the nation's banking assets. 14 big banks have 25% of the deposits. Someone benefited from the crash of 1929. Those who had all the money because they sold in 1928 bought banks at a lower price. They bought stocks at a lower price. Don't forget, for every stock sold, someone has to buy it. Now, when I went to college, all we talked about was who sold the stocks. We didn't talk about who bought them. Somebody bought stocks at a low price. Somebody had money in the market to buy stocks. But we didn't talk about those individuals, did we? Who were they? Those who had known the private reserve was going to do what it did. The purpose of the 1929 stock market crash was to convince the American people that, quote, capitalism had failed, unquote. The government was needed to solve the economic problems caused by this Wall Street. We needed a change in the economic philosophy of the government. And we did. We went to the polls and elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who offered the American people major changes in their government and in their society, as we're going to see. The private reserve financed the Second World War as well. It also financed a huge growth in government. Let's look at this, number 28. In 1940, government took in $6.8 billion and spent $9.5 billion for a modest deficit of $2.7 billion. In 1945, after the war was over, or during the last year of the war, the government took in $50.1 billion and spent $95.1 billion, a deficit of $45 billion. Notice the maximum spent went up 10 times, and the deficit went from $2.7 billion in 1 year to $45 billion in 1 year. Who was loaning the money to the government? The private reserve. Let me show you that your money has been borrowed. Now, this is an enlarged $20 bill, and you'll notice the line on the top. It says a Federal Reserve note. We're going to end with this. The word note is defined as, quote, a printed paper acknowledging a debt and promising payment, unquote. Your money has been borrowed, and you've promised to pay it back. It says so on your dollar bill. The Federal Reserve note. We've borrowed our money. That money has been created out of nothing, and we're going to pay it back. I want to invite you to tune us in again next week as we continue our study of money and this private banking conspiracy, and we continue to explore the secrets of history. Thank you so very, very much.
a series of lectures exploring the conspiratorial view of history. It is the contention of historian Ralph Epperson that wars, revolutions, and depressions are planned years in advance, and that those who have been involved in the planning of these events have been ensuring that their involvement has been removed from recorded history. It will be Ralph Epperson's purpose to discuss the major events of the past and to remove the veil that has been utilized to cover up the secrets of history.
Welcome to Secrets of History. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I am the host of this series. Secrets of History is a 24-week lecture series which will explore the conspiratorial view of history. I have been studying the historical view that holds that the major events of the past have been caused intentionally. About 2 years ago, I published my book entitled The Unseen Hand. I've subtitled it An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History. Tonight's session is number 14 in the series, and tonight we're going to continue our discussion of money, interest, and debt. And if we get some time, we'll start our study of secret societies. Last week we held up a picture of a $20 bill, and we referred to the very top line on all of the American money, wherein it says the Federal Reserve note. Federal Reserve note is what your money says on the top. I want to start there as we pick up our story, as we continue our study of money. The word note is defined by the dictionary as, quote, a printed paper acknowledging a debt and promising payment, unquote. The money that we're carrying has been borrowed, and we've promised to pay it back. Let me show you how the private reserve has affected the value of your dollar. Now, this is a graph showing the purchasing power of the American dollar since 1776 through the War of 1812, the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. Notice the sharp decline in the value after the private reserve was created. That's the blue line on this graph, and the end of the gold standard, the green line. In other words, your money's losing value, especially since we went to the private reserve and got off the gold standard. There is a growing opposition to the private reserve. In 1982, the Utah grand jury indicted the private reserve for violating the Constitution by issuing currency not backed by gold and silver. But even more recently, in the state of Washington, a state senator by the name of Jack Metcalf placed a referendum on the November 1987 ballot in his home state of Washington, as I said, about the private reserve. The voters were asked this question, quote, shall the state of Washington file action in the U.S. Supreme Court challenging the constitutionality of this nation's money system, the Federal Reserve? That was the question they were asked in Washington. His referendum had been approved by both houses of the state legislature by a vote of approximately 80% to 20%. 80% of the vote of the members of the House and the Senate in Washington felt it was time to challenge the constitutionality of the private reserve. But the voters in Washington did not agree, and only 35% voted in favor of the referendum. Still, some 300,000 voters in Washington understood the issue and wanted their state to challenge the constitutionality of the private reserve. In my opinion, it is a major victory for the opponents of the private reserve, because if this issue had been placed on the ballot just 20 years ago, it probably would have gotten but 7 votes. In other words, people are starting to figure it out, and I think it's wonderful. You might remember that Karl Marx wanted 2 programs amongst the 10-plank program he advocated in the Communist Manifesto. They were the central bank and the heavy progressive graduated income tax. America now had the central bank. The conspirators had to give America the graduated income tax. Our founding fathers were aware that the power to tax is the power to destroy. They carefully made certain that there was no income tax in the Constitution. Congress passed a law, however, in 1902, and they decided to give us for the first income tax ever in the history of the United States. That law was later declared unconstitutional. One of the judges on the Supreme Court declared this, number 29, It is a method, it, meaning the income tax, is a method to enslave our people and to deprive them of their liberty and right to the fruit of their labor. So after the conspirators had been rebuffed in their first attempt, they tried again. In 1908, they offered the states an income tax not as a law, but as the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. It's interesting that the 16th Amendment was introduced by Senator Nelson Aldrich, the man who helped write the legislation that created the private reserve. Now I ask the question, did Aldrich understand the program? He supported both the second plank of Marx's program, the graduated income tax, and the fifth plank, the central bank. And we got the graduated income tax in 1913, and we got the central bank, the private reserve, also in 1913, all because one senator, Nelson Aldrich, wanted both. Now this is the way the graduated income tax works, number 30. I took this off of a income tax form a few years ago, but just to illustrate the point, it's probably not valid now. Let's say your income is $5,000. Your tax on that, your income tax, is $810, which is 16% approximately of your income. If you double your income to $10,000, the tax goes up to $1,820, which is now 18% of your income. If you double your money once again, you don't pay 18% tax, you pay $4,380 or 22% income. In other words, as your income goes up, your percentage of tax goes up. That's the graduated feature. The more you make, the more you pay as a percentage of your income. Now, it's also very revealing that the unions have been fighting for the last several years for a cost of living increase for its members to keep up with inflation. But the graduated income tax, as we just showed you, takes an increased percentage of their income. Ultimately, the union members lose. In other words, they get a cost of living increase of 10%, and the graduate income tax takes maybe 2% of that. They end up with a net 8% increase. They're losing by the cost of living increase. I'd say this, if you're a union member, get your union to demand a cost of living plus graduated income tax increase, and then you'll stay even. I used to do a talk show in Portland, Oregon, and every year around April the 15th, I would ask the callers how much tax they paid that year, just to see whether they knew. And the people would say, oh, I was lucky. I got back $200 this year, or I had to pay, unfortunately, $400. I said, no, you didn't answer my question. How much tax did you pay? I just told you, Ralph, I got back $200, or I had to pay $400 or $800, whatever it was. I said, listen to my question. How much tax did you pay? Not many really knew, because their taxes had been withdrawn by the month, or by the week rather than all at once. I'd say this, if we have been conditioned to think, to think that April the 15th is the day we pay our taxes, but it's not at all. We pay taxes all year long and then bring it up to date on April the 15th. So I invite you to find out, when you pay your taxes, know how much you're paying. One of the very few things that I've agreed with President Ronald Reagan is that Reagan once proposed in California that they make the tax bill a monthly bill like they make your electric bill. In other words, you get a tax bill in the mail and you have to pay it out of your income. And suddenly when you start to see how much your taxes are each month, you might start complaining about it. As it is, it's deducted automatically, and you very rarely know how much you're paying. Now that the bankers had the central bank and the graduated income tax in place, the war on America's middle class could start. And the way to do that was to increase the size and scope of government, which would increase government spending, which would increase government debt, which would increase government interest payments. Each year, an organization called the Tax Foundation computes the date that the average worker has paid off all of his yearly tax bill. In other words, he starts on the January the 1st, and everything he earns daily belongs to the government until a certain date when he's paid up all of his taxes for that day, for that year. So they say then that after this date, then whatever you keep belongs to you. Notice this interesting graph that I prepared, number 31. In 1930, that date was February the 13th. In other words, you paid 11.8% of the taxpayer's income went out in the first month and a half. In other words, you paid all your taxes on February the 13th, and the rest of the money was yours. In 1984, that date was May the 1st, or 32.9% of the year. In other words, government has increased its take of the taxpayer's income nearly 3 times in 54 years. And we can see the growth of this income tax in another way. Number 32. Just want to show you the growth of government since 1945. This was the last year of the war between the United States and the German Axis powers. Roosevelt spent approximately, under his administration, they spent approximately $95 billion. In 1986, it was estimated that Ronald Reagan would spend over $1,000 billion, $1 trillion. That is what you call your basic increase in government spending. Now, that increase in government spending can also be shown in this graph. Now, that's 1962 on the left with a little over $100 billion of government. And that's 1988 on the right with over $1,000 billion of spending. Can you see the increase in government spending? I think you can. The philosophy of government has become simply number 33. Spend no matter why or how, and be as wasteful as possible. Spend and waste. That's what government is for today. Now here's an article that discusses government waste. I've got a couple of them I want to show you one after the other. This article appeared in December of 1987 and reports, quote, fraud in key welfare program may reach $1 billion a year, unquote. The purpose of government is not to stop waste and fraud, it is to perpetuate it. Don't forget, government today is to spend and waste. Here's another article that appeared in March of 1980, and it reported that, quote, welfare overpayment has passed the $1 billion mark. Once again, government is not trying to correct waste and fraud and hoax. It is trying to spend and waste. No matter what, spend. No matter what, waste. Now, this article appeared in the April 27, 1981 U.S. News and World Report. It reported that the Pentagon wastes an estimated $15 billion a year. Has Congress stopped that waste? No. Why? Because government is intended, that is its purpose, to spend and waste. The more that it spends and wastes, the more debt it creates. The more debt it creates, the more interest it creates. That's what it's all about. In 1972, a writer by the name of Dr. Susan Huck discovered that in its 19 years of its existence, since it was created in 1954, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare grew at an almost constant 27.5% annual increase. That means that the department was not growing because it was filling social needs. It was growing because it had to spend money. In other words, take this year's budget, increase it 27.5%, and spend it. And then next year, take that budget, increase that by 27.5%, and spend it. And then take that budget, ad infinitum, 27.5%. Can you understand? Government is not intended to help people. It is intended to waste and spend. That's what it's all about. As proof that government's purpose is to spend and waste, I'd like to mention the recently completed Grace Commission. You might recall that in 1982, President Ronald Reagan appointed J. Peter Grace to a commission called the President's Private Sector Survey on Cost Control. Now, this is a little booklet of a review of that Grace report. There it is, little paperback, called A Taxpayer Survey of the Grace Commission Report by William R. Kennedy and Robert W. Lee. Now, these two gentlemen didn't write the report. They just wrote the little review of that commission report. And that's what's in this book. Let's take a look at that. The book reports, that this commission discovered that more than $424 billion, B with $1 billion, could be cut out of the federal deficit simply by eliminating waste and inefficiency from the national bureaucracy. President Reagan pledged, quote, "This is not going to be just another blue ribbon ornamental panel. We mean business, and we intend to get results," unquote. Yet I know of no major program to end the waste in government. So government continues to spend and waste. The report warned us that if the government spending continues to grow at its current rate, our national debt will skyrocket to $13.2 trillion by the year 2000. That will be $18,000 a year in interest payments alone for each American taxpayer. Can you understand that? You will pay $18,000 a year in interest for the national debt if you allow this growth to continue. In summary, the purpose of government then is number 34. Spend no matter the waste, no matter whether it's constitutional. Secondly, create deficits. Third, deficits create debt. Fourth, create interest payments. And then lastly, the end result will be a bankrupted nation. That's what this is all about. Now here's how much the government has created debt, number 35. In 1945, the national debt was $258 billion. The per capita debt was $1,853, and the annual interest payment due was $4 billion, a little more or less. In 1986, the national debt was somewhere in the vicinity of $2,000 billion, or $2 trillion. The per capita national debt was around $8,700, and the estimated annual interest payment was $180 billion. In other words, we will pay back the interest and the principal for the privilege of carrying our own money. Now, we've been warned about this debt accumulation process. Senator Barry Goldwater said this just a few years ago in 1984, number 36. Goldwater said, "If we don't stop the deficit spending, I will be able to point to the year when we'll have national bankruptcy, and that will be within the next 5 years." Senator Goldwater said that if we did not stop creating this additional debt, this nation would go bankrupt within the next 5 years. 1984 plus 5 is 1989. Now this is 1988. We're getting close, aren't we? This is the first clue that something is going to happen by next year, 1989, because this nation is not stopping the debt accumulation process. So if Goldwater is correct, we're going bankrupt next year, and I believe he is right. I will be giving you additional clues that will indicate that next year, 1989, is the year in which something is scheduled to happen, and we're going to examine that in the next few weeks. And to show you that this debt accumulation will not stop, let me show you this article that was printed in the U.S. News and World Report on February the 7th, 1983. It shows the annual red ink deficit budget submitted by each of our last 9 presidents. As we pan across the red lines, notice that when we get to Ronald Reagan, the red lines are longer than for any other president. But Reagan's a conservative. The conservative position has always been against deficit budgets until we elected the conservative Ronald Reagan. Then we got more deficits under the conservative President Reagan than we ever got under the liberal presidents. Isn't that interesting? Number 37. Here is how much debt the conservative Ronald Reagan has given the American people as compared to the, quote, liberal, unquote, Jimmy Carter. In 4 years of Carter's administration, Carter gave us a total of number 37, Carter gave us a total of $181 billion of debt. Reagan, in his first 5 years, gave us $728 billion. Oh, we're lucky. Ronald Reagan's a conservative. Yeah. I like this cartoon because it graphically illustrates who loses in the deficit budget scenario. It shows a giant bear labeled the deficit about to devour either the taxpayer or the congressman. The taxpayer says, "But Congressman, you can't outrun a wild grizzly." And the congressman, who, by the way, you'll notice is putting on his running shoes, says, "I know. I only have to outrun you." Yes, and they are outrunning us, and we're getting eaten by the deficit budget. All of this debt has a price. We, the taxpayers, have to pay interest to those we borrow the money from. This is a pie-shaped graph showing where the money comes from and where it goes for the 1986 budget. That red pie slice-shaped portion of the pie, shown as where it goes, is the interest we pay the money lenders. This year, the interest was 9.3% of the total budget, or $142.5 billion. Now that's about $7,000 per taxpayer. Each of us pays the government back for the privilege of carrying our money. That is $7,000 that each of us will pay to the bankers for the privilege of borrowing money from those bankers. That also means that we taxpayers pay 9 cents out of every tax dollar we send government and it goes to the bankers as interest payments. Out of every dollar that we send to the federal government, 9 cents of it goes for interest payments alone. Isn't that interesting? That whenever the liberals in America say they want to increase social spending, they always say that they want to take the money from the defense portion of the budget. They never, and I've never heard a liberal say that they want to eliminate the portion we pay to the bankers. Isn't that interesting? In 1986, if the liberals wanted to spend $142 billion more for their pet projects, all they had to do was stop deficit spending and use the money we pay to the money lenders as interest. Yet, as I said, I can't remember once ever hearing a liberal recommend that solution. I'd like to ask you tonight, if you're a liberal, this question. Does the banking fraternity own you? Think about it. Why don't you protest the debt? Why don't you protest the interest payments? If the banking establishment did not own you, they would join with the true conservative, the one who's opposed to the debt process, and balance the budget. But they rarely suggest it. Why is that? Let me remind you of what President Franklin Roosevelt wrote to Colonel Edward Mandell House back in about 1930. "The real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element has owned the government since the days of Andrew Jackson." I think it is fair to say, in 1988, the real truth of the matter is, as you and I now both know, that a financial element has owned the government, including the government of President Ronald Reagan, since the days of Andrew Jackson. Something's going on in this country. It is time to stop it. Now, what will happen to America should it go bankrupt because of all of this debt? The government has taken onto itself dictatorial powers to handle the emergency that the bankers have created. Now, before we review a couple of the things the president can do, I'd like to remind you of a definition we discussed in an earlier program. The economic system where the government controls but does not own the factors of production is called fascism. Fascism is an economic system where the government controls but does not own the factors of production. The provision on banking restrictions, 12 U.S.C. 95A, which states that during a national emergency declared by the President, the Private Reserve Board can control all banking transactions conducted by member banks. The Credit Control Act, 12 U.S.C. 1901, provides that when the President determines that credit controls are necessary to control inflation, he may authorize the private reserve to regulate all extensions of credit and the amount of money loaned out to anyone. Now, what is the coming international solution? Since every nation is involved in this debt accumulation process, we'll need some international solutions. The New York Times told us a few years ago, number 38, new international rules should be drafted to determine when a nation's currency should be changed in value. The details, the New York Times said, the details of this change, of these such new rules, might well be kept secret, the New York Times told us. Secret from whom? The people. Are we going to know when they change our money value? No. They're going to do it in secret. Richard Cooper, a professor at Harvard University and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trial Commission, wrote this in the fall 1984 issue of the Foreign Affairs magazine put out by the Council on Foreign Relations, number 39. I suggest the creation of a common currency for all of the industrial democracies with a common monetary policy and a joint bank of issue to determine that monetary policy. Independent states, meaning the nations, need to turn over their monetary policy to a supranational body. In other words, let the international bankers control everything. That's the solution. They cause the problem, and then they solve it. And they're the ultimate winners of the game because we lose. One of the few clear-thinking economists is Professor Murray Rothbard, who summarized the whole process thusly. Murray Rothbard, number 40. So now we see that the business cycle is not brought about by any mysterious failings of the free market economy, but quite the opposite. By systematic intervention by government in the market processes. In other words, government is monkeying around with the economy through the money supply. It has no constitutional authority for that, and it's time we stop it. I'd like to now discuss some of the organizations that are leading us into this new world order.